Sota DAF YOMI SOTA, prioritizing values, בין כהן לכהנת. So the last few days, particularly yesterday, we've been talking about not only the quantitative dimension of an action, what the action looks like, what the action is constituted of, but also the qualitative dimension of the action. What is the inner force that's driving the person? What is the value that underpins the particular action that a person is carrying out, and how important that is? And we said yesterday that life without action is not life. Yiddishkeit without mitzvahs is not an halacha, is not Yiddishkeit. We need the actions, but an action alone is a body without a soul. The quality of the action, the values that underpin the action, are what give the action its soul and its meaning. Sometimes it happens that an action is underpinned by a positive value. Somebody has a belief that drives their action, and normally it's a good belief, it's not a bad belief. It's just inappropriate. Take, for example, Muslim fundamentalist terrorists. They're driven by a belief, they're driven by a value. It's not just murder for the sake of murder, they actually believe they're doing the right thing. It's just not the right value. There is a time for Mesiras Nefesh. There's even a time to kill other people. We've also got such mitzvahs in the Torah, but it's out of place. It's the wrong value in the wrong time. So it's not just a matter of looking at what is the value that informs my action, but is it the appropriate value? Is it the right value? And that becomes particularly complicated when we're trading values off, when values conflict with one another, which happens all the time. A person can believe in the value of honesty and in the value of kindness, but there are times when to be honest, you can't be kind. And to be kind, you're not going to be honest. So what do? And people distinguish themselves by the way they prioritize their values. Some people will say, I'm not compromising kindness. There's no way I can tell them as it is if that's going to hurt them. And another person is going to say, but how can you be dishonest? If that's what honesty requires, you've got to be straightforward with the person. They've got to know. And those will be two different people who both believe in the values of kindness and honesty, but they prioritize them differently. The Torah also prioritizes values and mitzvahs because there are very many times when they conflict with one another. And how just as with an individual, how an individual chooses to prioritize their values when they conflict with each other tells us much more about the individual's moral philosophy, their worldview, than just knowing what values they have. If you say this person believes in kindness and honesty, this person believes in kindness and honesty, but they're two very different people in the way they prioritize those values. It's the same with businesses and with the values of a business. A business might have all sorts of good values. How do you prioritize them when they're in conflict with one another? When the value of growth conflicts with the value of kindness or of customer well-being. How do you prioritize? The businesses define themselves by how they prioritize their values, not by what their values are. And we very seldom pay attention to that, to how do we prioritize values, because that tells you about your character more than what your values are. And the Torah also prioritizes values because they come into conflict with one another. And we had a good example of this in this week's Parsha, in Shmini, where we have a situation where Moshe says to Aaron, why aren't you eating the korban chatos? There's avodas beis hamikdash, you're a kohen, you have to eat the chatos. Aaron says, I'm an ovel, my two sons have just died. So we have a conflict now between dinei avelus and dinei avodah. The kedusha of the kohen and the avodah of the kohen on the one hand, and the dinim avelus on the other hand, which is prioritized. Moshe starts off prioritizing the avodah. And Aaron says that's not correct. And then Moshe accepts it and says, Vayishma Moshe vayitav be'einav. Moshe accepts the chidush of Aaron, who is mechadesh, the chiyuv avelus midoraisa, as the Rambam holds. The counter value we only get to in Parshas Emor, where the Torah says, Emor la kohanim ben Aaron, the nefesh lo yitama ba'amav, a kohen can't be metame for his relatives, ki im lishe'ero karov elav. Only a close relative, a close relative, he can be metame. So now you've got these two values. I've got to keep my Torah as a kohen, and there's a mitzvah of avelus. And now we see from Aaron, mitzvah avelus is a doraisa. And so is Torah a kohen. The kohen keeping his Torah, his purity, is also mitzvah doraisa. Which do I prioritize? So if I'm a kohen, and God forbid I've lost my father, and I don't have to be right there. There are other relatives, and there's a chevra kedisha. I can stand outside the ohel. They're burying him on the side of the plot. I don't need to come close to a dead body. I can keep my Torah, even though it's my father. Is that the right thing to do, to say, there's no reason for me to be metame? My father's being taken care of. Or is there a mitzvah in being metame? So the Rambam says in Perik Aleph Aleph, mitzvah aseh li'tabel ala krovim. It's a mitzvah aseh. Avelus, he explains that's avelus on the first day, is a mitzvahs aseh midoraisa. It's a positive Torah requirement to have Avelus, to go into mourning for a close relative on the first day. Moshe Rabbeinu was masakin 7 days of Avelus and 7 days of Simcha for marriage. But the Torah itself requires 1 day of Avelus. Not everybody agrees with that. The Smag, we've talked about the Sefer Mitzvos Gedolos before, of Moshe Mikotzi, who about 100 years after Rambam also writes a Sefer HaMitzvos, but unlike the Rambam, he gives sources for everything he says, which was one of the objections to the Rambam. And you remember he was the one who had the dream that was told he has to write a Sefer HaMitzvos, Mitzvos Aseh, Mitzvos Lot Aseh, that was Rav Moshe Mikotzi. He holds that it's not a Doraisa, that Avelus even on the first day is not a Doraisa. Let's stick with the Rambam. In Perek Beis, the Rambam lists which are the relatives that there's a chiyuv d'oraisa to mourn for and which are d'Rabbanan. And then a beautiful halacha of the Rambam in Perek Beis, halacha Vov, which we'll focus on. Kama chamura mitzvat avilut. Says the Rambam, look how serious the positive mitzvah, the mitzvah d'oraisa of avelus on the first day is. Because the Torah is willing to prioritize avelus over taharas hakohen. As important as it is for a kohen to keep his purity, in this case the Torah says not only be mitasek with your dead relative, not only take care of the burial, that's made mitzvah and all sorts of things which we discussed in Masechta Nozeh. But even if he's taken care of, there's nothing for you to do. It's just a matter of, are you close or not? There's a mitzvah to be mitabel. No, you go to the funeral and you stand in the ohel, even though you're a kohen. That's how serious avelus is. The Torah is teaching us, says the Rambam. This is an amazing Rambam. He seldom does this. The Torah is teaching us prioritization of values. That is important as the kuhuna is, avelus comes first. Shneimar, and he brings the rayas. The Rambam comes with a huge chidush. This is by male kohanim. HaKohanot, ho'il ve'enan muzarot ala tumah, but a kohanot, the women kohanot, since they don't have, there's no issur for them to be metameh. A woman kohenet is allowed to come close to a dead body. Kain einan mitzvot li'tameh lekrovim, so they have no mitzvah to go to the funeral of their close relatives. It's only a kohen, a male kohen has to go to the funeral of his close relatives. A female is not mechuyevet. She's allowed to, but she's not mechuyevet. She's allowed to go to any funeral. And since she's allowed to go to any funeral, there's no special mitzvah that she's got to go to a funeral of a close relative. The Ravid says it's against, that din of the Rambam is against a brisa that we have. And he brings a raya. From there we see a married woman, for example, has to be mitameh for her husband, even though she's a kohenet. So there we see there's a chiyuv tumah. Where does the Rambam get this from? That a woman kohenet is not chayevet, is not obligated to go to the funeral of a close relative. And this objection of the Ravid is so strong that uncharacteristically the Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Ravid against the Rambam. Where does the Rambam get this from? Says the Kesef Mishnah, is the mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch. Says the Kesef Mishnah, there's a Ramban that also asks that question and suggests possibly, Zot hasvara shema hu doresh b'zeh kol sheyeshno b'lo yitama yeshno b'yitama. Anybody who is told you can't go to funerals because you're a kohen is in the mitzvah of, but to your close relative, you must go to a funeral. But if you're not included in lo yitama, if you're not included in the exclusion, you're not included in the obligation. Maybe that's what the Rambam holds, says the Ramban. And then he brings another possibility. It says B'nai Aaron and so on. If the Ramban answers it and the Kesef Mishnah brings it, why does the Shulchan Aruch paskin against the Rambam? Because Harosh Katav, Shelo Nityashvu lo divrei Rambam. That even with this Ramban, says the Rosh, I still don't understand the Rambam, and the Ravid is right. Ki harbei tzarich raya liftor nashim me'amitzvah hazot. If you're going to come up with this chidush, this new idea that women kohanot are not obligated to go to their close relative's funeral, they may, but they're not obligated to, you need a proof for that. You can't just come with an idea, no matter how brilliant it is, you can't come with an idea that it's somehow you can't link to a reliable source. It's not authentic Torah. We have this problem today. Everybody's got an opinion and got an idea and got a vort, and it's fine, it's lovely. But unless you can find a hook for it in a reliable source, in Mishnah or Medrash or Gemara, Rishonim, then it's meaningless. Then it's your own opinion. It's got nothing to do with the Torah. And so here, the Rambam saying something very interesting according to the Ramban, but where does he get it from, says the Ravid? And on the contrary, there seem to be Gemaras against it, says the Ravid. Says the Rosh, he's right. Where does the Rambam get this from? There's an amazing Maratz Chayes on this Mishnah that we have on Chav Gimel Amud Aleph on our Mishnah. The Maratz Chayes, first half of the 19th century, very controversial because he uses the academic maskilim. So at that time there were the maskilim, there were people who were various degrees of religious adherence, various degrees of frumkeit, but they studied the academics and they went to university and they studied texts and they compared texts and they used that in their understanding of the Torah. And the frum world was very opposed to getting that because it was adulterating the methodology of the Torah. The Maratz Chayes was one of the several like him, we've had some of them, who were able to bridge the world of academics and the world of Torah. He himself got a PhD when the Austrian government required that Rabbonim have to have secular degrees. He went, it took him a few weeks and he got his PhD. He understood and he uses scholastic sources. So for example, the Hasidic world was very anti the Maratz Chayes at that time. But today it's at the back of every Gemara. In this particular Gemara, the Yalkut Meforshim at the back, there's this Maratz Chayes on this Mishnah. What is the difference between a Kohen and a Kohenet? And the Mishnah then lists a whole lot of differences. The mincha of a Kohenet is eaten, the mincha of a Kohen is not eaten. A Kohen can be mischalelet, and a Kohen cannot be mischalelet. It goes on. Asks the Maratz Chayes, according to the Rambam, there's another difference between a Kohen and a Kohenet. What's that? A Kohen has to go to his close relative's funeral, and a Kohenet does not have to shimei, there's no chiyuv. Why doesn't the Mishnah list that as one of the reasons? Answers the Maratz Chayes because of the proof of the Ramban brought in the Kesef Mishnah. Because the Rambam holds that there's a linkage between Tum'at Krovim Talia Bahadadi with Kedushat Kohen. The Kedusha of a Kohen, which prohibits him from going to funerals and being Metamei Meit, and the requirement to go to a funeral of a close relative, those two laws are linked. And since the Mishnah already tells us, since the Mishnah does tell us that female Kohanot are allowed to go to be Metamei Meit, they can go to any funeral. Based on the Rambam, there's no need to tell me again that she doesn't have to go to Tumas Krovim. So using this Maratz Chayes, we can answer the Rosh. Says the Ravid, where does the Rambam get it from? If you understand the Mishnah of the Maratz Chayes, he gets it from this very Mishnah. The fact that the Mishnah doesn't tell us that a woman can go to a funeral of a close relative, that a woman is not muktiyevet to go to a close relative. The fact that it's not included in the differences between a male and a female Kohen teaches us that they're all part of one halacha. And that Kedushat Kohen v'Tumat Krovim Talia Bahadadi. That's the Rambam's proof. From the very exclusion of this distinction between Kohen and Kohenet, the Rambam proves exactly, that's the source that the Rambam is looking for, that the Rosh is looking for the Rambam. An amazing understanding of the Mishnah, which helps us out with the Rambam. And this linkage we see in the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam as well, which the Maratz Chayes quotes. And the Rambam at the end of the piece in the Sefer HaMitzvahs writes, ולחזק חיוב זה בארותו בכהן שהוא מוזל על הטומאה, שיטמא על כל פנים כשאר ישראל כדי שלא יחלש דין האבלות. Why does a Kohen have to go to the funeral of his close relative? Says the Rambam, to teach us the importance of avelus. So the Torah smashes the protection of the Kohen from Tumah and says, in this case, you go out and be Metameh. To teach us, this is educational. It's to teach us how to prioritize the values. That the need to be there for your close relative's funeral is more important than your Kedushas Kohen. Don't hang on to your sanctity and use that as an excuse not to engage in life and in common decency. You've got to be at your close relative's funeral. Are you a Kohen? I can't be Metameh. No, you have to. And what happens if the Kohen says, but I don't need to, there are other people to take care of it. And the way the cemetery is set up, I don't need to be Metameh. Says the Rambam, based on the Gemara, we are Metameh you, we come and we push you in. Because the Torah says you've got to. For a woman, that isn't there. Since a woman is allowed to be Metameh in any event, there's no special lesson in her being Metameh for a close relative. And this is about a special lesson. That this din in Tumas Kohen is to strengthen the laws of Avelus, says the Rambam. And this ties into for example, we had on Daf Chafalaf Amud Beis, where the Gemara Rabbi Yeshua saying, what's a chosid shoite? A chosid shoite is a frum idiot. What is the case of a frum idiot, the Gemara asks? A man sees a woman drowning in the river, and he says, I'm not allowed to look. Let's say her clothes have come off, she might be naked or semi-naked. He says, I would like to save her, but I'm not allowed to look. Clinging to his sanctity and avoiding decency. That's a chosid shoiter. So you'll say, but is the action driven by good value? Yes. Does that make him a tzaddik? No, it makes him a chosid, but a chosid shoiter. It's not admired. It's a good value, but it's in the wrong place. This is not the time to hold on to your kedusha. And that we learn from this din of the Rambam. There are times when a Kohen should not hold on to his kedusha, because at that time what you need to be doing is being present for your father or your mother or your brother or your sister, not hanging on to your kedusha. What you need to be doing at this time, tzaddik, is saving the woman, not worrying about whether you can see her or not, and whether you should see her or not. That's not the issue. The issue is save the life, because that's more important in this particular case. And we have another example of that back in Gemara Yuma. You might remember on Daf Gimel in Gemara Yuma, where they used to allow the Kohanim to race up the ramp of the Mizbeach in order to, the first one who gets there gets the right to do the avodah. And there was a case where one cut the other off, and the one who was cut off took out a knife and stabbed the Kohen that got in front of road rage. There was road rage on the ramp of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mizbeach, which landed up in a death. What the piece that we often don't quote is the piece on the next Amud, where the Gemara says, what was driving this? Was it because murder is not so important to them, so they've downgraded murder? Or because what then happens, the father comes while his son is still kind of gasping for his last breaths, but he hasn't died yet, and the father pulls out the knife and says, the knife hasn't become tameh. The dagger hasn't become tameh. In the Beis Hamikdash, we don't have a tameh piece of metal. Look, I've saved tumah from the Beis Hamikdash. I'm such a frum person. I'm such a great Kohen. So says the Gemara, is that because murder is unimportant, or because the Kedusha of Beis Hamikdash and the Taharas HaKelim is so important to them? And in that piece of Reb Chaim Shmuel Levitz that I told you, where he quotes Reb Shimon Shkop, how often you can have two actions and they look identical, but they're driven by different values. And you have to know what the inner one is. He says, look, the Gemara is not even sure if this is an act of tzidkus or an act of rishus. The act is the same. A man comes and pulls the spear out of his dying son's body. Is that tzidkus? Because he says, yes, although murder is terribly important, but there shouldn't be too much kelim. Or is this, he doesn't care about murder. What he cares about is his whole mind. Your son's dying. All you're worried about is too much kelim. Is this a criticism of him, or is this an admiration of him? And the Gemara concludes it's a criticism, but says Reb Chaim Shmuel Levitz, using Reb Shimon Shkop's principle, you see, even the Gemara is not sure. You see somebody do something and you don't know, because you can't see their hearts. You don't know how they're prioritizing their values and how they came to the conclusion to do what it is that they're doing. It's the same with the Kohen. You see this Kohen standing on the side. It's his father or his brother's funeral, and the Kohen standing on the side. And you say, come inside, you're a Kohen, but you're allowed to be mitzvah. He says, I'm allowed to, but there's no need to. There is a need to. In this case, you've got to prioritize avelus over taro. That's your job. That's what you have to do. And you need to teach the importance of avelus by walking into that ohel and standing next to your father's coffin. That's what you need to do as a Kohen. It's not that you may do, you need to do. What about a woman? Does she need to? No, she doesn't need to. She may do, because she's not teaching anything by doing it, because she can go to anybody's funeral. But for the Kohen who doesn't go to anybody's funeral, to do it where he has a chiyuv avelus, that teaches the importance of avelus. And so we see that the way we prioritize values becomes very important. And we spoke in the shiur 2 days ago about how to learn and why it's important to understand Gemara, not just halacha and Mishnah. Because it's in Gemara you learn how to prioritize. It's all very well, you know all the halachas. There's a halacha of Tumas Kohen and there's a halacha of avelus. What do you do when they conflict with one another? How do you prioritize? There's shvichus domim, there's questions of murder, and there's questions of kedushas Beis Hamikdash. How do you prioritize? There's questions of Shabbos, and there's questions of pikuach nefesh. A person's ill, may you or may you not. There's questions of nida or arayas, where you're not allowed to touch a woman, but she's in need, she's emotionally or physically in need. Are you allowed to or are you not? For that you need the lomdas, for that you need to be able to learn. And that's what the importance of life as a Jew is, not just what our values are and how we keep the mitzvahs, but how do we conduct ourselves when values or halachot contradict with each other? What is our process of prioritizing? That's true understanding of halacha.